All right, let's go ahead and get started here. Welcome, everyone. You've got a homework assignment that's due on Monday. Anybody here take an initial look at that assignment so far? Oh, not as many hands as I'd expect. That long delay maybe gave you a false sense of security. I guess it's only Wednesday. You still got some time, right? Definitely get started on that, especially after we talk about internal rate of return. I think that you're going to have basically all that you need to work through that assignment, although there may be a few things that we cover in class on Friday that also go into that assignment. Remember that the other thing that you've got on your plate right now is the project. And so the project has, if I'm not mistaken, 6 phases, right? There's 6 different sections that you're going to include in the report. So maybe just as a planning tool, what you could do is try and set as a goal for yourself doing a certain section of the report by different deadlines. You know, you could look at your calendar and say, I'm going to take the next week to be thinking about income. Then I'll spend another week to start estimating my regular expenses and so on. So if you divide it into smaller pieces, it's going to be a lot easier to accomplish rather than trying to do everything all at once. Welcome. So any questions about the exam or about the assignment? All right. Well, like I said, we're going to talk about internal rate of return today. But before we do, remember this figure from last time? Sometimes concept questions, I like to ask concept questions, just explain an image to me, whether it's a curve or in this case, not quite a curve, but what's the point of this? Why did I show it to you last time? What is it illustrating? You'll notice that I cropped off the title of the vertical axis because I feel like that would give too much away. So anybody remember what's the point? Amortization schedule of a loan. Well, that's too many big words. You're right, but break it down like I don't know what amortization is.
It just shows you that at the end of the first year, you're going to have principal plus interest rate, and that's how much your payment's going to be, and then you're going to have interest off of that amount the second year, and then interest off whatever that amount is at the third year until it's 0.
Good stuff. All right. Said a lot of good stuff. But one thing he didn't say yet, let's see, does anybody know what's the title of the vertical axis? Yeah, you nailed it. Very good. Yeah, unrecovered investment balance. And so the idea here is that this is illustrating someone who's spending money to start a new investment. And we use the example of a food truck. So you're out all this money, and you're going to earn revenue each year, and hopefully there's more revenue than expenses, R minus E. So hopefully you're getting profits. And those profits in the future are reducing the amount of your investment that you haven't yet recovered. And recovered means you had to buy all this stuff, you had to outlay all that cash, and the idea of doing that is you're doing it now in the present so that in the future you have profits. So essentially in the present you're buying those future profits. And so what this illustrates is that over time, in this illustration after N years, that unrecovered investment balance was finally down to 0. So another name for this kind of an analysis, when we do it on a spreadsheet, this is closely related to the break-even analysis that you've seen a couple of times before. Break-even meaning that now finally those future profits balance out the present expense that you had. You know, the outflow, that initial payment, is in equilibrium with those future profits once they've been discounted to the present. So I hope that you're drawing those connections between related topics like unrecovered investment balance and break-even. Okay, so moving on. Here is just an illustration of a couple of different websites I got onto a few years ago to look up how auto rates vary from bank to bank. Maybe if you've ever taken out a loan, you know that not every bank is offering the same interest rate, both in terms of if you're lending money or if you're receiving money. If you go to Huntington Bank, then for an auto loan that has a term of 66 months, If the vehicle model year is 2017, then they're charging an APR 4.72%. And in contrast to that, the 66-month loan at Star Federal Credit Union, not quite the same big name as Huntington Bank, that credit union has lower rates though, 2.75%. So what I'm going to show you is that interest rates matter. In this illustration where, what if you were going to buy a truck and it was a $54,000 truck for some reason. I just never understand people who spend that much money on a truck, but everybody gets to spend money however they want. I spend mine on different things than some other people. So let's say, should you do it, if this was a business decision and you just don't, it's not all about cup holders and leather seats, you know, like if you're doing it to try and generate revenue, what if you were going to get an extra $900 per month by owning that truck? You know, it allows you to put people in the field doing a job, and so you're going to have some extra revenue. So, you know, if we were going to draw a cash flow diagram, what that would look like is some initial outflow, $54,000, $54,105, and then that gets you $900 per month. A equals 900. And what we're going to take a look at is for those 66 months, is it worthwhile? If we go all the way through 66 months. And here's a sneak preview of the answer. Should you do it? It depends on what interest rate you're using to finance the loan. Okay, so if you'd like to follow along, you can, but it's just fine if you prefer instead to watch. You're going to get some time on Excel today anyways, so you don't necessarily have to follow along with this one. But what we are saying is this is a demonstration of the effect of the interest rate. And so what if the interest rate is that first Huntington Credit Union where they're charged, Huntington Bank, 4.75%. So 0.04, no, not 75. 72, okay, 0.0472. Okay, so that's the Huntington interest rate. All right, and then this is, though, the annual interest rate. This is the annual effective interest rate. And so the Huntington, I'm going to label this annual. So the monthly interest rate is just going to be that divided by 12. Okay, so now I have the interest rate per month. And then the initial cost of this truck is $54,105. All right, and then the monthly revenue that we're talking about is $900. I like the sound of an extra $900 per month. All right, so now let's have month, amount, and then the present value of the amount. Okay, so it's the same thing we've done in the past where we have 0 through 66 years, and so I can drag this down. It's detecting the pattern is 66 months, thank you. So 66 months, each period is a month, and now it's going to be, the amount is an outflow of $54,105, and then an inflow of $900. I might as well just reference that amount there. So if I want to play around with it, then I can. I just double click and that spreads that down as long as there is adjacent cells with numbers. Okay, the PV function, we haven't used that in a couple of class periods, so as a reminder, the way that we do the PV function equals PV. We refer to the interest rate per period, so it's going to be the monthly interest rate. I need to anchor the reference with the dollar signs, otherwise when I drag downward it's going to look in the wrong spot. The N number of periods that it's discounting is just whatever month we're on. We skip over the payment field because we're not treating each of these like recurring payments for N periods. Instead, they're just some amounts in the future. All right. And then, so I don't go nuts, I'll change it out of the red. All right. Drag that down, and so you see that these payments get progressively less valuable. So $695 in month 66 is the present value of that $900 payment that will occur in that month. All right, so what we're going to do is we want to know the total PV. So I'm going to do, in this cell, the total PV. And so that's going to include the sum of all of the PV column. So the sum, including that first payment, and then all of the revenue. And what it shows is that $900 a month is great, but you're still losing money. I know where he's going after class. And now all of YouTube does as well. All right. So what it shows is that you are going to get some profits in the future, but not enough profits to cover your borrowing costs. The way to think about this is that, of course, the bank is taking their cut, and they're charging 4.72% per year for the money that you're borrowing. And so the $900 per month revenue that you're getting, you don't get to keep all of that. Some of it is going to be used to retire the loan. So how much is left over after you pay the bank? Well, at the end of 66 months, negative $1,879 is left over. So what that essentially means is that you bought the truck, did all the work, and you lost money. But if instead you had borrowed money from the other agency, Federal Star USA Federal Credit Union, so let's change that to 2.75%. So 0.0275. So the monthly automatically updates. Our initial cost and monthly revenue stays the same, but what you see is that since the interest rate going to the bank is less, then we actually have a positive present worth. You remember that decision criteria, that phrase decision criteria, is how you know whether a project is a thumbs up or a thumbs down. And so at 4.72%, the decision criteria says this project is not justified. Let's not buy that truck. But if you can get better financing, then the project is justified at 2.75%. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of projects in the world, not just buying a truck, but in the world of finance, there are a lot of projects that sometimes are possible in a certain interest rate environment, and then when interest rates go up and it becomes more costly to borrow money, then those projects aren't possible anymore. And so countries that have really low borrowing costs, like I previously have told you that, like Germany, for instance, has a really easy time borrowing money because they have a long history and a stable income and outflow ledger, and people aren't worried about being repaid. And so Germany can do long-term projects like building canals that are going to take a really long time to pay off. Those sorts of things are possible and feasible in Germany since they are able to have low interest rates, where other countries that don't have as long of a history of development, like emerging countries in the undeveloped world, they have a much harder time borrowing money, and so certain projects that could be possible in one country aren't feasible in the other country where they have higher borrowing costs. So that's the illustration I wanted to show you here, is that interest rates matter. Whether a project is a thumbs up or a thumbs down partly depends on how much money you have to pay to the bank, or of course the other way of thinking about it is if you're using your own money, what kind of a return do you want to make on that money? So in the case of the truck, what if you're not borrowing money from the bank? What if you have $54,105 in your pocket, but you know that you could take that money to the bank and put it in a savings account? So you're thinking, should I put it just in a savings account that's no effort at all? Or should I start my own business with that extra money? And how much of a rate of return do I want to make on my money? If you want to make 4.75% on your money, you shouldn't do the project. You can't make that rate of return. But if you're happy and if you're content to make 2.75% on your money, then you can do that. In fact, you'd make more. The fact that you still have some positive amount means that you're going to make more than 2.75%. And that's what we're talking about is, maybe you're seeing where this is going. If I wanted to, I could do a goal seek. And what if I did a goal seek where I kept playing around with this interest rate until this number was 0? Because what we just saw is one number where it was, one number where it was 4.72%, it was negative. And then when I decreased the interest rate, it went to positive. So the question is, somewhere in between, there's a crossover point. Does everybody get what I'm saying? Like if I was going to draw a graph of this, if I had present worth on the vertical axis and interest rate on the horizontal axis, when the interest rate was 2.75%, the present worth was positive. And then when the interest rate was 4.72%, the present worth was negative. So there's some crossover point where you have 0 present worth. And that's a meaningful point. Equilibrium. So this balance is showing that there's a certain interest rate where your cash inflow and your cash outflow is equal. And that same diagram that I showed you at the beginning of class today and in class on Monday, the unrecovered investment balance, how it perfectly went down to 0 after n years, that is when you're doing some balancing at the internal rate of return. So IRR stands for internal rate of return. And it's an interest rate that we use for decision making. We can use this calculation to tell us if a project is acceptable or not acceptable. And so generally it's an unknown interest rate that you're going to be solving for. And what it tells you is it's the interest rate where the inflow and the outflow is in balance. So by balance, what I mean is it means that the cost of the project and the revenues of the project are equal if you take them all to the present. So in the case of the truck, what magical interest rate is going to make it so all of those future revenues are just equal to the initial outflow that you had to pay for the truck? You can only calculate the IRR when a project is generating a profit. It can't be used for cost-only alternatives, like a public park, where there's not any revenue. It's just costs only. So you can only use it when there's a positive value for a project. And you can solve it on Excel or graphically. Solving it by hand is a little bit tedious because what you're having to do is iteratively keep changing the I value until the sum of the present worth is equal to 0. Now here's the analysis criteria. This is how you make a decision. If the internal rate of return is greater than or equal to the MAR, that means the project is acceptable. If it's less than the MAR, then the project should be rejected. So you can only use it for initial screening, though. This is a big, important warning I'm going to give you. You can't take 2 projects, calculate the IRR of each, and know which one is better. It doesn't work. And I'll show why it doesn't work in class on Friday. The only way that you can use this analysis is whether a single project is acceptable or unacceptable. So if you're sorting, like if you've got 5 alternatives, you can do the IRR analysis to all 5, and maybe 3 are acceptable and 2 are unacceptable. Well, among those 3, you still don't know which one to choose by IRR alone. Seems strange, but I'll show you why on that when we get to it on Friday. So this I star, that's the abbreviation that we use for internal rate of return. Last time in class, I showed you the I prime, and I prime means unknown interest rate. So that's all I prime means. And so then I star means internal rate of return. Sometimes it's unknown, but once we calculate it, and once we found the internal rate of return, then it's not a prime anymore. We just say I star. So I already mentioned that one of the ways we can think about it is it's the interest rate that brings everything into equilibrium. So another way to describe it is it's the rate that you're earning on the unrecovered balance, or the rate that's being paid on the yet unpaid balance. It brings everything into equilibrium with a zero balance in the final period. So the process is you're given a cash flow diagram like this, and you discount everything that's in the future. You discount it to year 0, and you start off with just some guess interest rate. So you try 1%, and then you see at 0, is it positive or negative? And you keep playing around with your guess of the interest rate until the present worth equals 0. And then that's the interest rate that you call the internal rate of return. So here's the method. You find it where all of the revenue and all the expenses are equal, and the equation that's shown in the book is that the revenue you take to the present at some unknown interest rate for k years. Each year, k through n, where k is the year from 0 to n, and you do the same thing with the expenses. They're taken to the present. Each future expense is taken to the present. And you're looking for the unknown interest rate that makes it equal to 0. So equal to 0 means that the revenue and the expenses are balancing out. Graphically, this is that trend that I kind of already illustrated for you on the whiteboard, that if your guess value for the I is too low, then you'll end up with a positive present worth. So that means that you're not discounting the future revenues enough, if that means that you've got a positive present worth. If your I star guess is too big, then you'll have a negative present worth. And so just the guesses iterate until it's in equilibrium. Okay, I already gave you the first warning that IRR can only be used to compare against the MAR. You can't use IRR to select which alternative is best. And the reason why, just as a preview for Friday, the reason why you can't use IRR is it can't identify which project is most profitable. There's other factors that also come into play to identify which project is most profitable than the IRR. Here's the other big warning that I haven't mentioned yet. There's an assumption that comes with using the internal rate of return. It assumes that any money that's being generated by the project gets reinvested back into the project and continues to earn at the same rate that it was originally earning. So in other words, it assumes compound interest. So you know the case of that truck? If we're trying to calculate the IRR, what we're assuming is that with each revenue that you get, each $900 payment, you're putting it into some account that is earning the interest rate that you're calculating. Now that is true in the case of a bank account, right? If you put money into a savings account, they'll tell you each month you earned $50. But they don't make you take the $50. You can leave it in the bank. And in fact, they love it when you leave it in the bank. And if you do leave it in, then the next month, the interest is based on the original amount and also the previous earnings. So that's just the definition of compounding that we've talked about before. So the internal rate of return assumes that all of those future revenues are earning the amount that is the internal rate of return. Sometimes that's valid, sometimes it's not, and we have other methods we can use if a project isn't able to reinvest the earnings at the same rate that the cash flow is generated. So we'll talk more about this warning, but those are the two things that you really need to keep in mind anytime you're tempted to use the IRR. Okay, so here's the in-class exercise for today. As I mentioned, we're using Excel. So let me give you the paper. So we have a cash flow diagram, and what you're going to do is set up your spreadsheet similar to what I did in the demo, like with the truck. You won't have to go 66 periods. So find the present worth at 7%, at 8%, and then copy your table. In case you don't know how to do that, look here in Excel. If you've got some calculations like this and you want to keep it so you don't have to mess everything up, you just right-click down here where it says Sheet 1, right-click, move or copy, create a copy. And so what I could do is I could say this is the original, and then like here's part 2. And so now I can keep the original, but then in part 2 I can play around with 0.0275. You know, like if I wanted to have a different sheet with different assumptions. And that's what I'm asking you to do in part 2 of the question, where it says to copy it to another sheet and then use goal seek. So take some time to do 1 and 2, and then there's this function called IRR. You can try and figure it out on your own. If you do, that's awesome. If not, I am going to demonstrate how to use the IRR function in just a few minutes. Double check how to do this one. Start a new. So here's the figure. Okay, so if you are borrowing money at 7%, this will be a profitable project because the present worth is greater than 0 when you're discounting the cash flow diagram at 7%. If you're borrowing money at 8%, this will not be a profitable project. By the way, just to remind you why we put in the double comma when we're using the PV function, look what happens if I don't have the double comma. Let's just use this year 8 as an illustration. So I'm going to delete that. All right. So if I have this reference to $377,000 in the payment field, Excel thinks what I mean is 8 payments of $377,000 each. Take that to year 0. That's not what I mean. What I mean is one single amount in year 8 needs to go to the present. So I need to skip over where it's expecting to see the amount in the payment. So right now it's seeing $377,000 in the payment field. So it thinks there's going to be 8 of those. But if I put in the double comma, now it sees $377,000 as a single future amount. that it's discounting to the present. So that's why we have that double comma thing in there. All right, now let's optimize this. Let's find out. I'm going to copy this so that I don't mess it up. Create a new worksheet. Okay, so this is my find I. Okay, so I'm going to use data, what if analysis, goal seek, and what we want to see is the sum of this present worth equal to 0. That's the definition of equilibrium. Inflow and outflow is equal by changing. So we're giving it permission to monkey around with this interest rate. And so we say go, and in just a few moments it suggests that the internal rate of return is 7.63%. Anybody else get that same number, 7.63%? Very good. Now remember, how do we use this? Well, we use this information to tell us whether a project is acceptable or unacceptable. So if your company's MAR is 8%, then this project is not acceptable. And the way you know that is either, when we were using 8%, you get a negative value for the present worth. That's one way to know it's unacceptable. The other way is if your company's MAR is 8, but this has an internal rate of return of only 7.63%. 7.63 is less than 8, so therefore the project is not acceptable. So those are just two sides of the same coin, a different way of looking at the same thing, that this project isn't yielding 8%, and if that's your minimum, this project isn't for you. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Anybody have success using the IRR function? Good, good. Let me show you, in case that's not something that was immediately obvious. The way that you use it is just equals IRR, and then you just put in the values. Now, unlike you've used NPV before, remember the secret to success with NPV is only put in the amounts that are in the future. In the case of IRR, you include everything. So you've got to remember the difference between the two. So you include everything, so the entire cash flow diagram, and what it knows is when you set up this range, it knows that at the top of the list is year 0, and the next number it sees is year 1, and the year after that, the amount after that is year 2, and so on and so forth. And so behind the scenes, it's doing the same thing that we just did. It's combining the present value function, the summation function, and goal seek all at once in one function. And so as soon as I press enter, it goes through and calculates that. And if I want to see the full precision, I can change the percentage that way, or if I don't want it expressed as a percentage, I can switch here to number, or general will give me all of the digits as much as there's space for. Any general questions about how to do this calculation? Now, I really want to caution you about something. In this class, sometimes it's tempting to think, well, I did the calculations, I've got the spreadsheet, I found the answer, that's good enough. That's like half of what you need. You need to be able to do the procedure, but then you also need to understand like the why behind it. You need to understand when to apply a certain procedure instead of another one. You need to know how to interpret it. And so really focus on the concepts. In the coming class periods, it's going to be really important to supplement the lecture where I focus mainly on the how, and we'll address the why, but you need to read the book to fully appreciate and allow the implications of some of these concepts to soak in. All right, before we finish up, let me just refresh your memory with one last look at the announcements. So the homework assignment that you're working on is due on Monday, and then also there's the project hanging over you. And I mean, the project is, you're looking at your own life. Everybody thinks they're fascinating, right? So the project is on the most fascinating thing you know, yourself. That's just one way to look at it. All right, I'll see you on Friday.